Welcome to Feminist Question Time, brought to you by Women's Declaration International, the leading global organisation defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. We have a declaration on women's sex-based rights on our website, womensdeclaration.com. It's been signed by 36,000 people, 36,876 people. It's also, they come from 160 different countries, and they are, we have 515 organizations who have signed up. They are from every continent and many countries. Do join us as a volunteer. Look on the website, womensdeclaration.com, for doing this. Today, we are going to hear from Dr. Maja Bowen, is going to be in conversation with Zan Dalio. They'll be talking about worrying compromises in gender-critical activism. Then we're going to hear from Nicole Mowbray from Australia, from Lesbian Action Group, and she's going to be talking about what's happening with the attempts to have lesbian-only events in Melbourne, but also in Australia in general. And then we're going to hear from Sue Clark from Australia, Women Up Queensland. So the first thing we were going to do before we get talking about the compromises in gender critical activism is say that many of us have just been watching the Standing for Women meeting in Dublin and how great it was. So let's maybe Zan and then Maja, if you say what you thought about it.
Yeah, I just caught the tail end of it, and I was just so impressed with the speakers and just the turnout. It was just wonderful to see, and it made me think of the whole Let Women Speak international campaign, which started. I feel really honored to have been at the very first one in Los Angeles, of the international ones. So it was wonderful to see, and there was just a lot of Twitter activity going on as well about it. Maja, you had something to say about it too?
Yes, hi everyone, and thank you for inviting me. Yes, with Let Women Speak, I can never make it down to the rallies, so I always follow them, and it's just been absolutely amazing watching the support grow over the years. And I think earlier on Twitter, somebody took a photo of the street in Dublin filled with women and men on the Let Women Speak side. Just, you couldn't see the end of the people, you know, it just carried on and on and on. And someone said, well, now it's really resembling a movement. And it was such a poignant, such a strong statement, because it really does. And I think many people have been commenting about, you know, taking taxis to there and taxi drivers saying, oh, you know, I hear people talk about it all the time and everyone thinks it's a lot of nonsense and things like that. So I think it's really something is happening, and it's wonderful to see. And I'm just so glad that the police have done their job and that everyone is safe, because that's always a real concern. So well done to everyone, and so many of us are there with them in spirit.
So how I didn't coerce her. I run the Twitter on WDI Twitter, which I guess is X now. And I saw this post from Maja, and I was quickly attracted to it. I see a lot of posts, obviously, and I can't read them all. And I was quickly attracted to it because I frankly, personally, wasn't aware of all of the concerns. And she made a very long, there was quite a thread about it. So I asked her to come on and talk about these concerns that she observed, some of which I wasn't aware of. And I'm sure there are others of you that are also not aware of them. We can't think of everything. And she has such a wonderfully acute sense of analysis and spends a lot of time thinking about things and talking about it. So I wanted to have her on once again and have her talk about her concerns.
We've been in all of this now for many years altogether, and a lot has been achieved. And, you know, it's actually quite heartening thinking back to 2016 or 2017 and compare it to where we are now. Women have organized, we have gotten clued on to what was happening, the activism has become, much more effective, and we've made tremendous gains. I think obviously we haven't, achieved everything we wanted, but a lot has been achieved, and in no small part thanks to all the amazing women and all the amazing organizations that have put aside their other projects and their other work in order to attend to this problem. So whenever I talk about these concerns, it is never to criticize anyone specifically. It is just something that I notice because I've got a bit of a long and complex life experience, and if you wish, I've seen things out of the best intentions be turned around, and I'm always quite on guard for things that can be pitfalls in the long run. So I think this is where my angle comes from, that I notice something and I go, ooh, or I notice something and then I see somebody offer a constructive criticism about it and I go, okay, well, that is a really good point. So I think now over the past, months and years, some of these concerns have crystallized for me. So I think as we tried to, I think we're all pretty desperate for this to end, we are all here to secure women's sex-based rights and to stop chemical castration of children and clinical abuse of gender non-conforming children. I think those are the two things that we can all broadly really agree on. So we are really desperate for it to be over. And I think in our desire to resolve things as quickly as possible, there might be some ideas that, perhaps should be more widely discussed. So if you'd like, I'll just go through the concerns that I've got and then we can.
Yeah, I have a list here too, and I can just sort of introduce them, and then you can speak on them. Some of them I'm not as articulate on them as I would like to be. But the first one is transition. So the first concern you have is this transition is right for some children. So why should we be concerned about that?
Yeah, I mean, that is, as a doctor, obviously, more of these medical concerns are more of my remit and more of my concern. So for me, that is a big one. I think there is a tendency to want to find the middle ground with what is happening. But if you really connect with what is happening, the idea that transition is right for some children might seem reasonable on the surface, but you need to first consider what transition actually involves. So transition typically involves so-called social transition, where children, and some of them can be very, very young, I mean, we're talking 4 or 5 years old, are misled into believing that they can actually be the opposite sex via the validation of these opposite sex identities. So usage of opposite sex pronouns, changing to a name that is classically associated with the opposite sex, change of clothes and style and all that. So that social transition was flagged up in Cass' review, which is a review by a senior pediatrician in the UK that was commissioned by the NHS. And Hilary Cass has flagged it up as not a neutral act because if you take young and impressionable children and you give them, give the credence to the idea that, even though they're a boy, they can be a girl, that's not a problem, they might come to believe it. And the reason why it's not a neutral act is because we have data dating back 30 years that shows us that if children are not validated in these opposite sex identities, and if they're just allowed to go through normal puberty, vast majority of them, I mean, up to something like 90%, will stop identifying as the opposite sex and simply grow up to be healthy, well-adjusted adults, often same-sex attracted or bisexual. So, however, with the social transition, in the milieu where this medical transition is not only encouraged, but mandated in many places in the world, children who are put on this path of social transition then progress onto medical transition. And medical transition basically involves blocking normal puberty blocking normal pubertal development by using drugs that are effectively chemically castrating children at the onset of puberty. And then studies that we have so far, particularly from Tavistock in the UK, show that something like 98% of children who were on puberty blockers progress on to other treatments such as opposite sex hormones. So what this means is that boys will not be allowed to mature, their bodies will not develop or sexually, their bones and their, cognitive development will be arrested at a pre-pubertal stage. And then they will be given feminizing doses of estrogen. So that means that their bodies will be then brought into severe hormonal imbalance. And then, ditto for females, there will be, puberty blocked and then given testosterone. And then a significant proportion of these children, now adolescents, and then young adults, will progress onto surgeries, which will be removing healthy body parts, such as breasts on females. They will be removing testicles and penises on males. These are so-called gender-affirming surgeries. So if you look at it in that context, to say that that entire process is right for some children, whilst we know that humans can't change sex, so you're not actually creating a boy out of a girl or a girl out of a boy, you are clinically abusing that child, and you are causing some very severe health problems in the long term for them. I think it is, as much as we would like to find the middle ground, what are we exactly finding middle ground on? We're finding middle ground with clinical abuse of children, and that's not right. And it's also important to say that, transition is right for some children presumes that some children are trans. And if you think about what is trans, trans lobby will like you to believe that that means that there is some kind of neurobiological basis which tells us that someone's been born in the wrong body, or that they have opposite sex brain. None of that. There is no evidence for it. Trans is simply a behavior, and often, almost always, it's a learned behavior. So for us to be saying that children deserve that kind of treatment and those consequences to their health and their psychological health as well, because they have, for some reason, and there are many reasons in a culture, including gender ideology being promoted heavily everywhere, including in schools, that they deserve that treatment simply because they've started emulating opposite sex. It just doesn't make any sense. So, from where I'm coming from, there is no such thing as a trans child. There are some who are, for a variety of reasons, desire to be seen as the opposite sex, or are led to, motivated to do. And that's why I think transition is right for some children is absolutely a wrong message to be giving anyone from our side, So that is my concern really with regards to that. And but I think desire to find a middle ground.
Yeah, I think that's the problem. That's the challenge, is this middle ground that a lot of people, women in the movement and people in general, want to sort of find, and living in a democracies as we live, it's like, can't we find some kind of middle ground in that? But it's, as you pointed out, it's like, it's opening a Pandora's box. Once you made the opening of the box really clear. What happens once you start doing that? And we have many, many examples in our societies, in our modern society, postmodern society, of once you open the Pandora's box of whatever, it becomes just, it's out of control. Everything ends up being out of control on some level. I mean, grocery stores used to not be open on Sundays. Now they're open. They're open 24/7, and that means that somebody has to work, at 3 a.m. on a Sunday.
And I mean, this is exactly what you see with this transition may be right for some children. You're saying this is exactly the attitude from the clinicians who started this whole thing about 10 years ago. They were motivated primarily with helping adult males pass, quote unquote, better as women by preventing masculinization in puberty, and then they started doing this to children. And I think to begin with, they believe that that it is right for some children, because eventually some children will grow up into adults who will desire this to have been done to them. And as we saw, this is spiral out of control.
Yeah.
Within 5 years of that starting. So I think it's exactly right what you said. It's a slope, and it makes no sense to me.
Yeah. The next concern you had was about the quote of, we should be doing RCTs on puberty blockers. RCTs are controlled trials, reoccurring controlled trials on puberty blockers. And no, we shouldn't be doing those. We should be doing them on what?
Well, the randomized controlled trials basically are the panacea of medicine. You know, it's seen as one of the most robust way of testing an intervention. Is your researchers and your subjects don't exactly know whether they need a drug or a placebo, and then you're blinded both sides to what has been given, and then you study the outcomes without prejudice. So that's basically what randomized controlled trial is. And now I think it's a misguided attempt that's come from the analysis that existing trans research is of very low quality. The methodology is very poor, follow-up, biases, confounding factors, and everything are just rife in that area. So I think one of the ideas was, okay, fine, if we can now get better research to show the outcomes. However, first of all, my concern is that these interventions have already been shown to be harmful, as we've just spoken about. This is chemical castration of children. So why should we be inflicting that on a new cohort just to get data when we already have data, whether the conditions under which these children were giving these drugs was okay or not, whether data collection was adequate or not? They've been given it, and there is a lot of children who have already received it. So yes, these studies could have been constructed better, but you always need to keep an eye on not inflicting unnecessary harm, and this is unnecessary harm. So there is a different, there could have been a different approach to this. I should just say, as part of what came out of CASP review, and now we have the new service specifications. Nothing that we really hoped for has actually happened. We wanted to stop puberty blocker prescribing. We wanted to stop any new puberty blocker prescribing, and we wanted to stop any cross-sex hormone prescribing for children. The new service specifications are continuing to prescribe puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for children who are already on it. And they are now proposing new trials on puberty blockers, which means that there will be more children that are basically pulled into this. And instead, what I would have liked to see is a complete stop to this medicalization, and then assessing children individually, anyone who has been affected, assessing the damage that was done, and then following them up and seeing what interventions they needed. Because what we actually don't know is to which degree are these puberty blockers reversible, and for how long. There is a puberty window, and for how long these children needed to be on them before some really serious long-term side effects kicked in. So there is a lot of information that we could be studying without continuing to hurt children and without hurting any new children. And I think this data and looking at reversibility and what interventions are required to bring these children back into hormonal balance would be essential for the health of the transitioners. We already have a huge number of people desisting and stopping with these taking these medications, and they're they've got severe side effects and long-term effects on their health. Their hormonal health. Women are struggling with premature menopause. Men have very low testosterone and things like that. So this kind of data on reversibility, how long, what is needed, can actually help a growing cohort of people, young adults who are now emerging. None of that is necessarily happening. The transitioners aren't necessarily front and center in this proposal in any way. So this is what I'm really concerned. And also because, as Hannah Barnes's book, A Time to Think, has flagged up, there are some very serious demographic characteristics of children who are overrepresented in this cohort, and many of them come from dysfunctional families, they are children in care, they have multiple psychological problems and things like that. So when in the situation where there is growing awareness about the danger of these interventions, you have to ask yourself which children are going to be enrolled. It's going to be children who are more vulnerable, who have less oversight, maybe no parents or parents who would advocate for them. So there is another ethical problem there that this may now end up affecting the most vulnerable children as well. And I think that is a complete opposite from what we should be doing.
Right. Then you talk about the push for sex inaccurate language, and or you mentioned that in your tweet, on euphemisms for medical surgery, all of the, the lingo, gender affirmation, and how it minimizes the harms of sex inaccurate language. Here at WDI, I mean, I'm very clear about the language thing. I think that's the first thing. I even have a challenge. I'm challenged to even use the word trans. I do the Dansky thing, because just because. So could you talk about that, the sex inaccurate language issue and the euphemisms that still are they're still around. We see them. I see them on Twitter all the time.
Yeah, I mean, that's been a really big one from the very beginning. There's always been, I think as the activism evolved, the awareness of the importance of using accurate sex language has grown, because it has been promoted as simply a kindness to people who have quote unquote gender incongruence. And, there is a lot of, history of using wrong sex pronouns for people within LGB activism, particularly drag and things like that. So it's not new. And however, it absolutely underpins the success of this ideology. Using a she for a man has resulted in, I'm sure most listeners already know, but men in women's prisons, men on women's hospital wards, men in women's toilet, men in women's sport. And if you try to argue that she, quote unquote, shouldn't be competing with women, you're not going to get anywhere if you validate that lie. Also, from that lie, we got self-ID, which means that any man can now say, I'm a woman, you need to call me by a woman's name and use she, her pronouns, and that is then used in reporting. So you have media stories about female rapists and female pedophiles, which are of course men. And it also has, gotten so embedded into our institutions that now this sex secrecy, which has ensued simply by a man saying, I'm a woman, call me by a female name and female pronouns, we can't even, we have this thing called DBS checks in the UK where, if you're going to work with vulnerable people, children or adults, you need to be checked for whether you've got a criminal record and things like that. All of these things are now basically rendered non-functional, because anyone who has declared the opposite sex identity and demanded to be referred to as the opposite sex in language is basically their sex and their data is being completely concealed. Medical records are the same. You say, I'm a woman, but I say I'm a man, I get a new medical record, and all you're ever going to see is male. You're going to be looking at me, but if you don't see me, you're going to think that you're talking about an actual man. So there is a lot of, particularly with pronouns, a lot of damage that it has done. And I think also the euphemisms for, some of the more damaging things, like for example, transition. It's not a transition, it is inducing iatrogenic harm in a vain attempt to change somebody's sex or to make them look like the opposite sex. It's not top surgery, it is an unnecessary double mastectomy on a psychologically distressed person, often a child. So these euphemisms serve to minimize, to distance people from what is really happening. It all sounds very pleasant and non-confrontational, and you can just distance yourself from the reality of it. And I think it's also very powerful in making children feel that if they want to go down that route, it's really no big deal. Oh, I'm just going to get a bit of a top surgery, and now you're calling me Leo, I'm a he, him, everything is. By the time that poor girl is 25 and, you know, her health is in a really bad place, no one really wants to know, because that's now possibly a detransitioner or a harmed transitioner. So I think, I think in all of this, you now have portrayal of women who, in my opinion, rightfully keep pointing out that we cannot compromise on language. We have to be crystal clear because it is essential for what we are trying to achieve. Those women are presented as extremists, and often they're presented as extremists so that those who are willing to make these concessions can say, but you see, we are not like those extremists over there, so please negotiate with us because we're going to be more reasonable. And you're just getting this slow creep into something that is not going to really end all that well for what we're trying to achieve when you combine it with all the rest of what is happening. So
Yeah.
that would be
I mean, I think it was, I just read a Kelly J just pointed out, I think that's where I read it or heard it, just right before the webinar, that, you know, the trans activists haven't budged an inch on any of their, you know, on any of what we're trying to get across. They haven't budged an inch in all of these years. And so, you know, this idea of compromise by, you know, sort of playing along with the language thing, it's hogwash, it's poo-poo. Let me move on, though, to the next point, because I think it's also relevant. Amending the Equalities Act 2010 to clarify sex referring to biological sex may have unintended consequences. You say that there may be alternatives that could do a better job. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so in the UK, we have the Equality Act, which covers, you know, protected characteristics on the basis of which a person cannot be discriminated against lawfully. And one of these characteristics is sex. And there are also now exemptions to that say that for the, you know, for the purposes of the Act, single sex provisions, if they are necessary, for example, women only wards or women only health services and things like that, it is then permissible to discriminate on the basis of sex, as in to exclude males. Now, because these trans activists have had years of basically unlimited access to politicians and institutions, that have managed to convince them convince them into things that they're not, that are not really lawful. For example, they misled everyone to believe that it's not legal to exclude a man as long as he identifies as a woman. So this is where we now have an issue, you know, with regards to women's single sex wards and prison accommodation, things like that. So the main issue here is that I think yet another example of a really good idea that I initially, you know, supported and thought, well, this is brilliant. However, it was flagged up that Equality Act already very clearly defines men, women, boys and girls. It says quite clearly that a man is a male of any age and that a woman is a female of any age. So that's the Equality Act definition of sex. And single sex exemptions make absolutely no allowance for people who hold these gender recognition certificates. That is to say that people who have these sex falsification documents are still can be excluded from opposite sex services, even if they identify as the opposite sex. So that is quite clear in the Act already. The Act does, under the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, does mention reassigning of the person's sex. So that is perhaps a problematic wording, but nowhere else in the Act is it not clear that sex is in fact biological sex, because male and female are biological categories. Now, the proposed amendment wishes to change that original definition of man is a male of any age, woman is a female of any age, into now going into detail that a man is anyone who is born male, even if they acquired the opposite sex via gender recognition certificates. So that is now complicating what is essentially a very simple definition, and it's introducing two types of sex: biological sex and so-called legal sex. And the unintended consequence of this can be that there is many laws in our country that refer to sex, that don't clarify now whether it is going to be a legal sex or biological sex. You're now actually affecting the rest of the legislation by changing that particular wording. And what could be potentially a better, approach would be to perhaps specify, change the wording under the protected characteristic of gender reassignment to say that it is the person's gender that is being reassigned rather than person's sex. And then we can talk about what gender means, and let's now define gender in law, blah, blah, if we want to. Or perhaps to remove protected characteristic of gender reassignment altogether and put it under religion or belief, because there is no real reality to it. There's just people who believe they're the opposite sex. I mean, that's a bit of a more radical approach. And ultimately, what we really do need is to repeal Gender Recognition Act, because it is a sex falsification law that embeds secrecy around the falsification of sex. And as long as it is in place, it will make any sex-based rights impossible to ensure, because there's always going to be people with documents that are stating falsities, and it's going to be up to frontline staff to now say, no, I'm sorry, you don't pass as a woman. And then you have an angry trans-identifying male, having a problem with that and suing the service. And, all kinds of other outcomes can be anticipated, including people just refusing to provide single-sex services, because Equality Act does not compel anyone to provide a single-sex service. It only makes it lawful, if you see what I mean. So if it becomes too risky for people to provide that service, then they will just not provide it. And that's going to be legal as well. And we're just going to end up in even more of an issue. So, I just wanted to kind of use Maya Forstater judgment as an example of slightly unintended consequence. It was one of the most important judgments in entire gender critical activism in the UK. And its importance cannot be underestimated. But as soon as the strategy was announced to argue on the basis of gender critical beliefs, there were concerns in the community, people saying, well, why are we relegating stating simple scientific facts to a belief? And we were all reassured that it is the best way to argue for this. And perhaps it definitely was. Clearly, the judgment was successful for us and the appeal was successful. However, what happened there is that gender critical beliefs, which are simply, that's a terminology for people's right to state obvious facts of sex in humans, was equated to gender ideology beliefs. So they are now both beliefs and they are equal. And it was only gender critical beliefs that were interrogated in court, because previously Maya Forstater was, the judgment that she appealed against was the judgment that stated that her right to say that sex can't be changed is not worthy of respect in a democratic society, quote unquote. So this is what needed to be overturned. And even though she was successful, what you ended up with is that gender ideology, her right to state biological facts, i.e. her right to hold so-called gender critical beliefs, was deemed to be worthy of respect in democratic society. But at the same time, so was gender identity ideology, right, without being actually interrogated. And in the judgment, because of this equating of the two, the judgment concluded, well, no, but for me, what stuck in my mind was that it was still said that you cannot misgender people with impunity, which means that if there is still compelled speech, there is still compelled, etc. So even though this was a really important judgment, and perhaps that was the best way to argue for it, there was a slight unintended consequence to it. Yeah. So even with a resounding success, we just need to now, consider that the trans lobby is so strong and the institutions are so captured, even a slight loophole will be exploited. So yeah, that's for me why I think it's very important to just be super careful if we're going to meddle in legislation or try to amend anything, just to kind of hear out all the concerns and just make sure that we don't end up, perhaps making things worse.
Yeah, and I mean, what it brings to the fore for me is just how utterly complex all of this is, and for the vast majority of people in the world, and let's just say the Western world, it's overwhelmingly complicated and difficult to follow and to understand, and it's not a high priority for a lot of people. Let's face it, until they're confronted with it, personally. And maybe that is going to be part of one of the tipping points, is as people become more and more familiar with these issues from a personal experience, then it gets transformed into some kind of larger movement that has some political clout that we're gaining little by little, but still we're far from, I think, our goal. View also, and some of the ways that gets manifested are in the way that, things you've also articulated in terms of the idea of having access to sex aggregated spaces, that they should be based on appearance, how masculine or feminine does somebody look rather than their biological sex, or that female sport is for anyone who didn't go through male puberty. These are all the same kinds of, yeah, we want to get to the, we want to make have some solutions. We want to compromise, but these all have all of these, they're compromises that don't really work in the long run. There's too many loopholes, like you said.
Well, yeah, I mean, with regards to access to sex segregated spaces, I think this is exactly what we have now. We have access based on appearance. It's just that who is going to be the judge of whether somebody passes or not, And right now, the judge is, trans lobby, who have captured institutions ideologically and policy-wise, and you basically have a man with a scrunchie in his head shouting at a woman, claiming that he's to a woman, so good luck ejecting him. I think there is a valid concern about, some women worry about women who have undertaken steps to really go as far as possible to masculinize their appearance. And you do see these women with beards and big muscles, and, on the photos, they look very convincingly male. But in real life, often you find that they're quite short and small and have female body habitus. So it's slightly different when you see them on pictures versus in real life. But yes, some women have, the so-called trans men, have taken severe steps to appear male. And in the situation where we are now, women are becoming, rightly so, paranoid about the presence of men in women's spaces. We cannot just disregard the concerns that some women have of encountering such a woman and then perhaps not being able to tell whether it's a woman or a man, and it is quite distressing. And this is, I think, where this whole idea of accessing spaces on the basis of appearance comes from. But there are two issues with that. First issue is that sex segregated spaces are not 100%, they're not compulsory. So if a woman has masculinized herself and identifies as a man, she can and often does use opposite sex spaces like loos or what have you. And the second is that if you are going to eject masculinized women, you have to accept feminized men. And this is where we are at the moment. So I think there needs to be, an acknowledgement that women, even if they are masculinized, may need to use women's single sex spaces, they for safety or for healthcare and things like that. We cannot, in my opinion, justifiably bar women who have masculinize themselves via these treatments from female-only spaces. We should have some kind of way of that women can trust that masculinized woman isn't indeed female. So, now there are different ideas that I've seen around, including, ID cards that can be issued by organizations that still have data integrity. In the UK, it seems to be connected to national insurance number that they still keep. They're the ones who are able to authenticate whether somebody is indeed male or female, regardless of their GRC, because they keep records from the very beginning. I think you get an NI number here when you're 16. So that is one of the unadulterated data trails, is that a national insurance number data that they hold on everyone. So, you know, I don't necessarily have all the solutions and all the answers, but it is certainly something that we need to debate and discuss and find a better way, in my opinion, than just saying access based on appearance, because then we are, you know, basically where we are now, and we are letting down a lot of women and girls who, you know, also need sense.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, I didn't consider the woman who's calls herself a man side of it. And I don't know what I think about that. I mean, I kind of feel like it's a contradiction, you know, if you're gonna say it's, you know, yeah, I find it a contradiction, or maybe not. It's just, it's one of those confusing things. I tend to sort of intuitively, when I see a woman who's takes hormones, I kind of can identify them pretty quickly. I mean, they don't really ever look like real men, but yeah, but I think for me, and I'm sure I speak for others as well, is that you know, why do we as individuals have to do the policing? You know what I mean? You know, and I'm a pretty rowdy. I can confront people, but I don't want to do it all the time. That's what gets me incredibly angry, is that these issues are, you know, are put upon our shoulders as individuals, rather than the state and laws being passed to police and care for. There is a real neglect, a social neglect, I find, that comes with all this, that is disheartening. How are we on time, Joe? I don't have a clock in front of me.
Right. We are coming to the end, so you've got about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
Okay. And just for people to know that Maja Bowen is going to come to the breakout rooms, so you can talk to her there, and she will put her camera on in the breakout rooms, so we could carry on in the breakout rooms. But you've got about 5 minutes now. Okay, let me skip to the one on the bottom that I think is interesting, that I'm not so familiar with, which is you're concerned about signing up to pledges and initiatives by trans activist organizations in order to appease them. What is going on there? What that you're concerned about?
Well, it's just that is more of a minor concern, I would say, that I've just sort of seen recently. There was again, trying to meet in the middle, trying to find common ground, and there was some initiative for signing a relationship and sex education pledge by a trans activist organization called Brooke. And when you read the pledge, it sounds pretty sensible. But when you look at the Brooke website, they actually promote sex falsification. They promote puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for minors. They repeat misleading information about reversibility of these interventions. So in effect, it's why do we need to do that? You know, can we not just come up with our own pledges and our own, you know, things, and find organizations that might not be quite so dedicated to trans ideology? Because otherwise, you know, by wanting to find the common ground, in a way, we're bolstering everything else that they're standing for. And there was just one more thing that I wanted to mention before the end, is just one thing that really concerns me is this tendency to say male people and female people instead of men, women, boys, and girls, and saying young people instead of children. This male people, female people doesn't distinguish between adults and children. And because this ideology is so fixated on adultification of children and erasure of the boundary between adults and children, I think it is actually essential that we talk about men, women, boys, and girls, even if that might make things a bit more uncomfortable with regards to describing trans identifying people.
Oh, one other thing too that we talked about before we went on air. You know, the politically the growing focus on detransitioners and trans, what are called trans widows. Is there some kind of, I mean, should we be, how much attention politically should we be attending to them? And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think with regards to detransitioners, I think unfortunately they more often become a resource than people who get help from our community. I think it's completely reasonable to expect people who have been through it all to share their stories and try to help everyone else get insights into how to stop other children going down the same path. But I'm acutely aware that detransitioners have a lot of need for support, for counseling, for job support, for health support, and all that kind of stuff. And at the same time, I'm seeing them trying to do so much for others that I'm growing slightly concerned about us. Perhaps we should focus more on securing resources for these people rather than asking them to do something for us. And with regards to trans widows, I think these women have seen in their own homes, in their own lives, the absolute destructiveness of adherents and people who are possibly pushing this ideology, which are autogynephilic men. So I think their stories are uncomfortable, they're confronting, and particularly they're confronting for people who wish to find middle ground and try to mollify the opposite side. And I think they're also often disregarded and not listened to and presented as some kind of extremists. What I would like to see is I would like to see them front and center. So I would like us to look after those who have been most affected by this, and they are children and wives of men who transition, or even women who transition. You have in lesbian relationships also situations do happen. And then also us to, as a community, put some thought and effort into providing help for the transitioners.
So this is the book that was written in 2022 by our previous speaker, Dr Maja Bowen, and it's in the name of Isidora Sanger, Born in the Right Body, Gender Identity Ideology from Medical and Feminist Perspective, and it's available in a wide range of places. And that so that's something, if you want to follow up on some of these ideas, you could do that. And then we also have another book coming up that I want to show you about, is a WDI book, which is coming. There's going to be a launch on the 13th of October. It's called Women's Rights, Gender Wrongs, the Impact of the Global Impact of Gender Identity Ideology, editors Kath Aiken and Sally Wainwright. And there are 35 country reports. They detail the progress and setbacks for women's sex-based rights as set up by the UN and reiterated by our Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. And there are also writers, chapters, not just country reports, but also impacts on different countries and theoretical pieces as well. So you can go to the launch, tickettailor.com here, and we'll keep on promoting it in the webinars. So now we're going to hear from our next speaker, who is Nicole Mowbray from Australia, from Lesbian Action Group. Thank you very much for coming, Nicole. Nicole is a lesbian feminist who came out to a thriving lesbian community in Melbourne when she was a teenager in the mid-1980s. She watched the lesbian community being decimated by the corporatisation and the rise of LGBTIQ to the point where everything is now underground. She's a member of Lesbian Action Group and a founder of LGB Alliance Australia. So thank you so much for coming and talking to FQT today, and over to you, Nicole.
Thanks, Jo. I suppose I'll start with the Lesbian Action Group. We've come together fairly recently because we're all underground. The whole lesbian community is largely all underground in Australia and around the world. We're what you'd probably call lesbian elders. We had the best of the lesbian scene as it was back in the day, 70s, 80s and the 90s. We had absolutely no problem organising events, single-sex events for lesbians, because lesbians, as you know, are solely attracted to other women, females, adult human females. And we had a thriving community in Melbourne. You could go out any night of the week and find a lesbian-only something happening. There were bars, there were bookshops, cafes. We had balls and dances and discos, book groups, sporting teams. There was even a sex shop, a lesbian-owned and run sex shop for women. Not necessarily just for lesbian women, but it was a women's sex shop. We coexisted quite happily with the gay men. They had their own single-sex events. We had our own single-sex events, and we happily came together in mixed space events. We both groups respected each other's need for single-sex events. And everything was good. As I said, we had absolutely no trouble organising ourselves in single-sex spaces. And all of us in the Lesbian Action Group, we range in age from sort of 50s through to nearly 80, I think, years of age. And we've watched the decimation of the lesbian community, and we've been underground for at least 20 years now in Australia in order to have single-sex events, public single-sex events. So we can't publicly advertise what we're doing. Everything's through a closed network, which is crazy. It's crazy. We can now legally get married here, but we can't legally have a public single-sex event. It's actually illegal for us to have a public single-sex event, and we have to apply to the Australian Human Rights Commission to get an exemption in order to hold a single-sex event. So the Lesbian Action Group, we decided to put in an exemption application because we want to run a public single-sex event for lesbians who are female, female born and bred, as it was in the days gone by when we had single-sex events for lesbians. So we put in an exemption application, and we thought we would like to have a lesbian-only event to celebrate International Lesbian Day on the 8th of October. So in goes our exemption to the Human Rights Commission, and we thought a good venue for this event would be the Victorian Pride Centre. The Victorian Pride Centre is an LGBTIQ plus state government funded, purpose-built building in the heart of St Kilda, which is one of the trendy suburbs of Melbourne. And it's a very kind of, has traditionally been a bit of a gay and lesbian haunt. It houses numerous LGBTIQ plus organisations, and it rents out space to the community. So we thought this will be a great, that's where we'd like to hold our celebration of International Lesbian Day, because you would think that they would be happy to host lesbians, given that they're an LGBTIQ plus facility. So they get wind of our exemption application because we wanted to do it all legally. So we knew we had to get an exemption so we could hold a single-sex event, put in the exemption application, and then we approached the Pride Centre to rent space to hold the event. Not only were we turned down by the Pride Centre when they realised that we wanted a single-sex event, they then wrote a submission to the Australian Human Rights Commission telling them to not support our exemption application. So they actively were discriminating against a group of lesbians, if you can believe that. So at the moment, we're waiting for the Australian Human Rights Commission to see whether they will approve or not approve the exemption application. We will not be having our event at the Victorian Pride Centre because of their hideous homophobia towards us. They will not sit down and have a conversation with us to try and work something out. They've basically said that, what did they call it? They said our exemption application is a divisive stunt that goes against their diversity and inclusion. So we would say that hiding behind that diversity and inclusion nonsense, they're actually discriminating against lesbians, and they're discriminating against our right to assemble in single-sex space. Australia are party to several international human rights conventions through the UN, including CEDAW. And as you know, as women, we in those conventions, we have the right to assemble as in our cultural group. So they're basically they're breaking those international human rights conventions that Australia is party to in all of this. So that's in a nutshell what's going on down here. It might also be worth mentioning that here in Victoria, where I am, we have some of the worst laws that have come in recent time. It's called the Conversion Suppression Act. It came in as a bit of a Trojan horse, saying that they were outlawing conversion therapy towards gay and lesbian people and bisexual people. Those conversion practices haven't been practiced for decades here in Australia, as far as I know. And with that Conversion Suppression Act, they've slipped in that it's basically illegal to not positively affirm someone's gender identity. So let's say a child tells their parents that they're the opposite sex, and the parents don't positively affirm that child's declaration and trot them off to the gender clinic. Those parents can potentially have a child protection caseworker assigned to them, and there has been a couple of instances where a child has been taken from the parents because of this law, because the parents refused to positively affirm the child, and the child's been taken into state care and put on the gender conveyor belt, basically. So our Premier of the state has publicly said there is no debate when it comes to transgender people's rights. So whenever women stand up, and it happened here when Kelly J. Keane came to town, we were branded as Nazi bigots, and the Premier said that there was absolutely no discussion for women. We're Nazi bigots, and we're not allowed to say, look, can we have a voice? So, yeah, I know Britain's quite ahead of us now in terms of where things are for you. I'm just hoping that in the goodness of time, things will start to get better here. It's probably not going to happen until we get a change in government. And quite ironically, in all of this, it's the Conservatives that are very supportive of women's rights now. The left, we've got a very far left government here now, extreme left. And there's no room for anyone in the middle anymore. It's either extreme left or extreme right. But the moderate right, are very supportive of what's happening for women and for the LGB people here. So we know here that mainstream rainbow LGBTIQ plus, organisations are not. We know that all the funding is going to the TQ. There's very little there for the LGB, and again, a bit like those laws, the Trojan horse laws that we've got. They're using the LGB as a front, basically. We're the ones that we started. They've taken over our movement of gay and lesbian liberation, and it's now the movement of the TQ, as we know. So the Lesbian Action Group has sort of formed in that sort of arena of what's happening here on a larger level. We're sick of being underground. We've seen the decimation of what's happened, to our ability to meet publicly. And I guess as elders of the community, we're very concerned for younger lesbians out there that have no community. When they come out, all they've got is the corporate LGBTIQ plus community. And that community, as we know, is it's the fast track to the trans industrial complex. They are using young gender dysphoric kids for the trans industrial complex. That's where they're recruiting kids from, because let's face it, LGB kids, we're the original gender benders, and we do get, gender confused at times. When I was growing up, I was a tomboy. I grew up to be a healthy lesbian. I had gender dysphoria when I was a teenager. If I could have opted out of being female, I would have. Absolutely, I would have. But I was left to go through puberty, and I was left intact. And I grew up to be a butch lesbian. Happy days. But if I was growing up now, I wouldn't stand a chance. Would not stand a chance against this. There is nowhere for young lesbians to go. And because us older lesbians have had to go underground, they don't have older lesbians as mentors. I had some fabulous older lesbians as mentors when I was a young lesbian, and I really value that. It's really helped me in the world, as a gender non-conforming woman. So we're very concerned about the fact that there's no mentors out there for young lesbians. There's nowhere for young lesbians to go. So in putting in this exemption, we're wanting to, I guess, see where it goes. We know that the laws are against us. We know that the LGBTIQ plus corporate organisations are against us. And we're just going to wait and see what happens. And we're getting some legal advice to see if there's, if the exemption is knocked back, which we suspect it will be, because the Human Rights Commission here is fairly captured. We're not expecting to be successful. It would be nice if we were, but we're not expecting it.
Can you unpick for women who might be newcomers to this issue, why is it a problem for, let's say we were going to run a disco or have a lesbian dinner, whatever, at the Pride Centre, and we called it a lesbian dinner, or let's say a disco, an event. Why is it a problem for lesbians? If you could explain that for women who don't understand, why is it a problem to have a few men who say that they're lesbians in there?
Because it's really important for women to have female-only space, separate to men. Men rule the world. They get whatever they want anyway, and now they're trying to impose themselves on a bunch of lesbians that want want to have their own event.
Yeah.
And there's no respect. There's no respect.
And I mean, I've been to
need.
plenty of women only and lesbian events, and if there are what I've found, I mean, is that if there's a man who is working at the bar or fixing the video camera, nobody seems to really worry, because they're there as a helping, but they're not participating as women or as lesbians. But the moment there's somebody, a man who says he's a lesbian, it changes everything. Is that the same that you're feeling?
Oh, absolutely.
And
the Pride Centre started a lesbian book club, and a friend of mine trotted along to that, and they read largely all trans books, and they changed, because it was full of trans women, they changed it from a lesbian book group to a lesbian-ish book group. So it's compulsory mixed sex.
Yeah.
Now it's compulsory, you know. We're on the outer if we want to have single sex events.
Yeah.
And
what we've found in Britain, or certainly in London, where I live in London, there are a couple of lesbian events that have been set up in the last year, and they're both private. So one of them is in a private pub with a nightclub, and the owner is happy for it, and it's very popular. And women are coming from all over the country to it, actually.
Wow.
And so that's really interesting, that the public institutions and publicly funded institutions seem to be very quickly saying no, like or cancelling things. But private, there may be some space in private areas, and there's another one.
Yeah.
How about that? Has that worked in Australia yet?
That could work. That's an option. We could set up a private lesbian club.
Yeah.
And we could then have single sex space.
Yeah.
And that may be an option. That may have to be an option.
Yeah. And so you probably know about the LGB Alliance helped to defend lesbian speed dating.
I've followed that.
Yeah. And so that's another sort of, it was in a private venue, or it's a pub chain, but that's another positive step forwards, that possibly people who are motivated by just getting drinkers in, or people in won't be so ideological.
Yeah. And then there was a Tasmanian, they tried this in Tasmania last year or the year before, and the Human Rights Commissioner knocked back the exemption application, saying that it would be, what was it? That you know, you can't do genital checks at the door, basically. And it would be, you know, going against people's, you know, right to privacy and whatnot. But our argument would be, if women were respected for the need for single sex space, there would be no need to check anyone's anything, you know?
Yeah.
But unfortunately, we don't live in that world. The other thing about this whole issue here is the Trans Centre run trans-only events.
Wow.
Sorry, the Pride Centre run trans-only events.
So that's completely contradictory.
It's so hypocritical. It's astonishing.
Yeah. So it's inclusion for some. Is it? We need to be inclusive.
That's right. Yeah. So they can do what they like, but we're told what we can do. It's crazy.
I've got another question, which is, again, going back to sort of unpicking for women who don't know this and haven't thought it through. If you can't have a public event and you can't advertise it as lesbian only, what impact does that have on women considering coming to the community, or to young lesbians. So if you're not allowed to publicly publicize your events, what impact does that have? Yeah, can you explain that?
Well, we've been underground for 20 years, and unless you know us, you're not going to find us, which makes it really hard for women who are coming out. They can't find us, and that's why we want to be able to have publicly advertised events. So it's a problem. It's problematic. We don't hate trans people. That's what we're told that we're hateful bigots. We're not. We fully support trans people to have their own events and to live their lives, like the rest of us. We just want to be respected, that women need their own space. Lesbian women particularly.
Yeah. I know another thing I've thought of is if we had loads of lesbian events all over the place, there would be too many for them to come to all of them. So, but unfortunately, there are so many men who want access to women that's correct, maybe they would just come to all of them. And I've got one final last question. LGB Alliance Australia, how is that going? Is that growing?
We are going from strength to strength.
Yeah.
We've got thousands of members now.
Yeah.
And every day we get new join-ups, people joining up, and it's taken us a couple of years to set the groundwork as a proper organisation. And we've got a bunch of really smart, talented people working there.
Yeah.
Give all the credit to Kate and Bev for setting it up. It's so needed. Yeah. You're several years ahead of us. We're a bit backwards down here in terms of where we are politically and also, in making progress.
Yeah. It's it does seem that there are some things that are happening here that are quite positive, but hopefully that will be the way things go in other countries. So
that's what I hope too.
Oh, and actually, the only other thing I want to mention is Giggle. That Sal Grover, who is the founder of Giggle, which is a women-only dating app. Is that correct? It's a women, and so is that lesbian? It must be lesbian if it's women-only. Yeah.
Lesbian and bisexual women.
Yeah, and that's she won her case, or at least she was. The guy dropped his case.
No, it hasn't. It's still being. I think it's being heard next year. It's going to court next year sometime. So it hasn't been resolved. At all. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, at least there's that is an event as well, or it's
in the wings, and that if she wins that will change the landscape here. That will absolutely change the landscape.
Yeah, brilliant.
Because basically, sex is being erased in Australia. The concept of sex. And gender is the preferred, taking precedence, basically.
Yeah.
So it's pretty dire.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep going. Thank you very much.
Absolutely,
for coming.
Thanks, Jo. No worries. Nice to meet you.
And see you soon, hopefully.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. We're now going to hear from Sue Clark in Australia.
So what I'm talking about tonight is about grassroots action, and I'll just tell you a little bit about what we've been doing in Queensland. We're a newly formed group. Leah Whiston and I formed this group in May, and what prompted us to do that is, I guess many people in Queensland at least would know about the stickering of Shannon Fentiman's sign, the Attorney General, in May. I won't name the person that I was with who actually did the stickering, but a week after we did that, Shannon Fentiman came out and actually gave us gold, the way she responded to a sticker, which was the dictionary definition of woman, an adult human female. She stated that it was basically hate speech and that we did a lot of damage to many people in that community. So the following week, what we did, there were 5 of us that got together, and we had a big banner which said, woman, adult, human, female. It was like a double bed sheet, really quite large, and then smaller call flutes, which just had the dictionary definition on that. And we went into an area outside of Shannon Fentiman's office, who's also the Minister for Women. She's no longer Attorney General, she's Minister for Health. And we thought that the public may not know a lot about this issue. And we were quite surprised by the positive response we got. And it was very empowering. And so after that, because even Jordan Peterson tweeted about this, and he's got 4 million followers. So it really did make Shannon Fentiman look quite stupid, really, to react like that and to make such a big deal out of it. So Leah and I got together and we formed Woman Up. And it's just about actions. That's what we do. But Leah in June made this incredible phone call to a plastic surgery in Brisbane because she saw on Reddit a 15-year-old talking about how she had a double mastectomy. So Leah rang up and she was told that they would do double mastectomies on girls as young as 13. And so Leah wanted evidence. So she rang back and she spoke to a different person and she put it on record. And they did actually confirm to Leah that they will do double mastectomies or top surgery on 13-year-old girls. While we don't have any evidence that they have done that on 13-year-olds, we definitely know that they're doing it on 15-year-olds. So what we did is, first of all, the Daily Mail reported on it, and that was excellent, that article. And even there was a call by leading surgeons calling for a national medical regulator to set clear and specific guidelines. And Mark Ashton, he's a counsellor of Australasia College of Surgeons at the Melbourne University. So that was a positive outcome to that. So then we went outside the surgery and we did an action, and there was a banner and it just said, the name of this surgery will do double mastectomies on minors. And it's a very, very woke area of Brisbane, and we weren't sure what we would get from that. But it was about 75% positive. So we're very happy with that. And then we went back about 3 weeks later and did it again. And the positive response was even greater than that. So it just goes to show you get out there and you know the public is not supporting gender ideology. So we just want to empower women to get out there and do these sorts of actions. It can be a very successful action with even 2 people. If you have a big banner, it's very, very effective. It doesn't have to be professionally done. It's just a sheet with the words on it. So then for the Women's Rights Network in July, we stood outside of the FIFA Women's World Cup and we were giving out leaflets, fantastic leaflets from the Women's Rights Network. And it was, again, very, very positive, but the FIFA security weren't happy with us being there. And they tried to tell us on the the first night that FIFA controlled the streets of Brisbane in a 2-kilometre radius and told us that we weren't welcome, which was, of course, not true. They did have some control around the venue, but not what they were considering. They felt very threatened that we were there. And the leaflet just was saying the biological advantages of men over women in women's sports. So then, we do a speaker's corner in Brisbane each month, and we're hoping that will grow. So that's another action. We record that and we put it up on YouTube as well. And we did another action recently outside Shannon Fentiman's office. Again, very, very positive. And just on Friday, I'm sure that you've heard about Gillian Spencer from the Queensland Children's Hospital, or I guess people in Australia would have heard. And she's currently got 71 doctors that have signed a letter to Shannon Fentiman asking for an inquiry into the gender-affirming care model in Brisbane, in Queensland, and Shannon Fentiman's refusing to meet. So what we did on Friday is we stood near the Children's Hospital, and we again had these two massive banners, and we had quite a few people there then. I think it was about maybe 8. And once again, we caused a bit of a stir. The hospital staff were coming out. There were doctors, nurses, staff that were there trying to intimidate us, with taking photos of us. But the interesting thing was, you could tell they were doctors. They had their stethoscope around their shoulders. And of course, whether or not they felt really good about the action we were doing, they couldn't come up and say, oh, you're doing a great job because of the way Gillian's been suspended. And that was sort of, a dog whistle to other people within the Children's Hospital. Don't speak out against gender ideology. So, so we've been doing all those actions, and that's just from May. And we did our first street action, except for Speaker's Corner, in July, and we're still in August. And we just want to encourage women to get out there, even if there's 2 or 3 of you, to stand on a street. They're doing it in Melbourne as well. We did, with IWD, organise an action, and we supported that action. And it was at the National Labour Conference in Brisbane last weekend. God, I think, yeah, it was last weekend. The time just goes so quickly. And what happened there was, unfortunately, the Greens were there, and they were in opposition about the cost of, the rising cost of rent. So they were there protesting, saying they wanted rents frozen. We didn't anticipate that we would get such aggression from the Greens. So we don't go into an area generally where we think there's going to be any sort of risk. But they encircled us, and the police eventually had to break the circle and take us out safely. So, yeah, even the Greens Party is quite dangerous. So, and also, if you do actions, because there are these activists, there's a well-known antagonist in Brisbane, and they will try and hack you. So we do all our organising on Signal. So if you're going to do an action, I highly recommend that you do it on Signal, where it's encrypted. And because there was this well-known antagonist, he did actually infiltrate, and they'll go to great lengths to infiltrate. So you really do need to make sure that you're safe. When you're doing the sort of pop-up street action, we do it for just about an hour. So we've never been at any risk at all. So we'd love to see in Queensland all the different regions of just women coming out and just doing these roadside actions, because it then says to you, because when you're sort of in this bubble on social media, you don't really understand what the public's reaction is to it, because all you're ever told is that the majority of the public support it. That's not what we've found. We've found well over 90% of people don't support it. And Angie Jones and a couple of women in Melbourne do street actions as well. And Angie said it's overwhelming down there as well. It's about 98%. So, and after we did the National Labour Conference, we all went onto the major overpass in the city, and we did banner drops for Save Women's Sports. And we got massive support there as well. So we just really want to encourage people, and it can be done cheaply. You just get, maybe if you've got old sheets or old call flutes which you can paint over, that sort of thing. It doesn't have to cost a lot of money, and it is just so empowering, and the public love it. We get cheers, we get people beating their horns, we get people clapping, singing out in support. It's just incredible. And then you realise that we can defeat this ideology. We just need to get out there, and once people see us out there, that will make them feel a bit more brave about going out. So really, that's just what I wanted to talk about is, so we started the group in May and really did our first action on the 1st of July. And we've done quite a number now, and we're going to get out there hopefully every week or every 2 weeks. So I just want to encourage women to do that, and also men, because we've got support from men as well. That on Friday, when we did the one at the Children's Hospital, we had a man there that came and supported. So that, you know, there's a lot of men that are just as opposed to this ideology as well. And if you can get people together, I can tell you, you'll make a big, big difference, and you'll come away from those actions and feel really good, because you know that what the politicians are telling us, what the trans lobby are telling us, it's not what the public are thinking.